Well, shall we start? We're a little early, but is it okay with you all if we start? Yeah? Okay, let's do that. God be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the life and witness and story of Pauli Murray. Thank you for all that she brings to us and to the church, and for Julie Cohen and the filmmakers and storytellers and historians that bring her life to us today. Amen. So today we are in part 3 of our Pauli Murray thing that we got to do. So I talked about Pauli Murray a bit last week. Those of you that hadn't seen the film got to watch it last week, some here, some on your own. Thank you for doing that. And today we have the director of the film about Pauli Murray here to tell us about that process. So part of what we did last week is I tried to talk a little bit about what you might or might not. It's her life as an Episcopal priest is not the focus of the film necessarily, because she did so much in her life. So this is about the film. This is for Julie to tell us about how she discovered Pauli Murray and how they put this work together and what she's learned in that. And then for you all to ask her questions. Part of the course of making a film is you become an expert on the topic. So we have an expert on the topic that can speak to that both culturally, historically, and as an artist and filmmaker. So Julie, welcome. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And so we're watching you from, and in conversation with you from Budd Hall, which is the parish hall at St. Luke's Church in Atlanta. There's a big race, there's a marathon that the grocery store chain is hosting through our neighborhood, and it's pouring rain outside. And yet this room is filled with people eager to hear you. So I don't know if you can see that, but there's not a lot much more there aren't many more people we could have in here and still be somewhat reasonably COVID safe. So this is great, and it's a strong response to Pauli Murray and to your work. So thank you for being here with us.
It's an honor to be here.
So can I start? I'll start with a question. There's a microphone right there. I've got some questions, but this is really your conversation as well. So after I do my first one, just come on up and ask what the questions you've got, all right? So my starting question is, tell me how you encountered Pauli Murray. How'd you meet her, and how did this film come about?
Yes. Well, we came to Pauli Murray. It's an unusual experience, actually, to be making a documentary about someone who had already been gone for 35 years before we started the process, and also somebody who, frankly, unlike some of the figures that you might make a biographical documentary about, isn't someone that we learn about in school or a current contemporary pop cultural figure in the way that the subjects of some of the other films that I've worked on have been. My directing partner, Betsy West, and I actually learned about Pauli Murray towards the end of the process of our making the documentary RBG about Justice Ginsburg, which came out in 2018, and which as we were finishing up the editing process in 2017, we became aware of the fact that Justice Ginsburg had put Pauli Murray's name on the first brief that she ever wrote for the Supreme Court in a case making at the time, and the time being 1971, very radical argument that women should be covered under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. RBG put Pauli Murray's name on that brief as a co-author, not because Pauli had literally worked on that case, but as a hat tip, as is the current social media way of saying it, to a person who had really developed this idea prior to Justice Ginsburg. And through the process of putting our RBG film out in the world, you do so many conversations with people all around the country, conversations like this. And it was really more through those conversations where we found people sometimes asking us, oh, whose shoulders did RBG stand on? And Pauli Murray, of course, is one of the answers to that question. And it led us through really the Q&A process to start doing a little bit more research and start Googling, like, who is this? We knew that this was a Black woman, or I'll now say woman identified lawyer, from the 20th century, but we really weren't aware of the vast array of accomplishments of Paulie's that I don't want to say that we lay out in the film. I want to say that like we touch on a few of them in the film, because this is somebody for whom the scope of accomplishments is so wide and deep and high, like every dimension, that actually it's kind of impossible. It would have been impossible to fit it all into one documentary that, feels like a coherent story. And I appreciate being called an expert on Pauli Murray, but I think I would have to dispute it, because you almost need, I think, a higher degree of expertise in history or in academics to understand the full scope of Pauli Murray. I think I do have, there are sort of slices of Paulie's life that one can understand. I have some legal background, so I understand some of the legal stuff. I know a fair amount about the history of the women's movement, so I understand that. But like understanding the full scope of Paulie's contributions to civil rights, understanding Paulie's literature and poetry, which is so expansive, and then, of course, relevant to a Sunday morning talk in a church today, everything that Paulie contributed to spirituality and theology is another whole scope of expertise that I do not have. So, which is all to say, we learned about this spectacular person, teamed up with the film's producer, Talea Bridges McMahon, and the editor, Cinque Northern, and the four of us kind of delved in to Paulie's archives, because the real driving force, interestingly, for this film about Pauli Murray is Pauli Murray, who had the foresight, as in so many other areas, to just save everything, not only, boxes and boxes, 141 boxes of writings and notes and diary entries and drafts of legal briefs, but on top of that, more than 800 photographs, going back to an era where people weren't taking a lot of photographs, let alone saving them. Like there were lots of photos from the night. I wouldn't say lots, but there were photos from the 1920s and even 1910s in the archive. Then there were 40 hours of audio taped interviews and oral histories. We later found in another archive the audio taped reading of Paulie reading the autobiography Song in a Weary Throat, and we found even some video. So Paulie had the thought in life that history was going to be very interested in all of the Pauli Murray works, even if the current day was less interested. And we even learned from our consulting producer, Patricia Bell Scott, who is an Atlantan herself, that Paulie had the idea in mind that a film would someday, there would be a Pauli Murray film made someday. So the materials were all there to tell the story, and that's why we we're excited to do it.
Well, and to that point, because Patricia Bell Scott, if I remember correctly, is her first biographer. Is that right?
I don't want to say first, because I'm not sure. There have been Patricia Bell Scott and Pauli Murray knew each other by letters anyway, by correspondence, going back to the late 70s, I believe, certainly the 80s. And Patricia Bell Scott is the author and University of Georgia emeritus professor who wrote a book called The Firebrand and the First Lady about it's kind of a dual biography of Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt and the places at which their fascinating lives intersected.
Right. So to the point that you've just made, that Pauli Murray seemed to know that she knew she was a historical figure. Can you say some more about that? Because I just find that shocking for someone who isn't in an elected office or something like that.
Yeah, I think really what distinguishes Pauli Murray's work in so many different areas and ties it all together is this incredible foresight. and understanding what legal ideas might come into play and might make sense maybe 10 or 20 years later, that after the time that Paulie is having them. Understanding even in literature, the family history that Paulie wrote called Proud Shoes, which I encourage everyone to go order and read for yourselves, because it's really an extraordinary book, but it really it's really foreshadows so much of the kind of memoir writing and nonfiction writing that would become popular later. This was published in the late 50s, and actually was quite well reviewed at the time it came out. I don't want to say it was a massive bestseller. It wasn't, but it was put out by a major publisher and got plenty of attention. But Paulie was writing a family history, was writing nonfiction to read like a novel at a time that most authors, people just weren't really doing that yet. And it's like heavily researched, but really told as a narrative. Anyway, so Paulie has all this foresight in all these different areas. And I think one of the foresight had to do with a certain kind of self-awareness of, there are ideas whose time has come, and there are ideas whose time has yet to come. And Paulie's ideas and Paulie's life story were the kind of, were just full of ideas whose time hadn't yet come, but was going to come soon. So that was, I think, the very thoughtful process behind saving everything for later scholars, writers, students, and even filmmakers to pore over.
So I've wondered this in looking over her books, her autobiography. Were people like this at that time, or was she as unique as she appears to be? Did people feel, was that a time in history in this country where people
far forward from where we were, or is she really as unique as she seems to be?
Yeah, I think possibly one of the lessons that we think of the film is that Pauli Murray was not as unique as this figure might appear to be, because Paulie was unique. There was like a level of intellect and kind of like just a quantitative level of output in so many different fields that certainly is unusual, if not unique. But in terms of having ideas that are way ahead of the curve, both intellectual, legal ideas, literary ideas, and activist ideas, I think that's an area where Paulie isn't unique. Paulie for the, even some of the things that Paulie is credited for, we were pretty careful not to use the word first in the film, because, the interesting story of Paulie getting arrested for sitting in the front of a bus in 1940, 15 years before the much more famous Rosa Parks case, it tells us something about Paulie's character and willingness to do something and, being ahead of the time that it's recognized. But that was like so far from unique. Black Americans in the South were protesting segregation in transportation, education, and housing from the time that segregation laws were imposed. I mean, it's just, and in fact, if one looks at the Black press of the era, one will see that while the New York Times may not have been covering these protests, the Black press was covering these protests heavily, and they were happening actually quite frequently. It's just that people didn't want to hear about it. Like, this wasn't a protest. And of course, in the case of the Rosa Parks protest, that was a very planned out, there was a whole movement that surrounded it. So, there was a thought out, publicity campaign to bring this to the fore as an important activist movement. And so that's how that became a moment. But I think you can find in even, Paulie Murray's innovative legal ideas. I don't want to say that nobody had come up with those previously. It's just that Paulie was having the ideas much earlier than they're famous for having. And Paulie was having ideas in so many different areas that certainly this is an extraordinary person, if not entirely unique in each area.
If anything, right, it critiques how we hear about history, right? That there's the moment in history that we hear about when the change got made, but there's the 50 years before, the 100 years before of movements of regular people understanding that there's a problem and there's a solution, right? And trying to work towards that. So one example would be that the Brown versus Board of Education case, like one of the reasons that came forward is the dean of the law school at Howard, with intention, was drawing people into the law school at Howard to work on what became the thesis for that case. Like they worked on that for, I want to say for decades, if that's not, I think that's right. I think it was decades that he was doing that. What's interesting about him is he didn't like Pauli Murray, which I heard some very personal stories. He didn't like Pauli Murray, but she was not recruited to be there. She decided she would be there.
Right. And, I think not only being a woman, where at a time that women were not particularly welcome in law schools or any other graduate program for that matter, but also Paulie was a little bit older than your usual student. Paulie had actually a tremendous sense of intellectual self-assurance that would lead to, speaking out in class at a time that the professor may not have wanted to be challenged. So, I think you'll find, I even have an example from seminary days that I can talk about later. Like, Paulie was not always making friends in all locations. And, sometimes speaking up for what you know to be right isn't really the best way to make friends.
One of my
when I got to St. Mark's and found out that she'd been on the vestry of St. Mark's, she was the first woman on the vestry of St. Mark's in the Bowery, I was really excited. And so I started to ask people about Pauli Murray. I was like, you all must have known Pauli Murray. And everyone said, tight-lipped, yes. And it was a gracious church.
Yes, RBG's way of putting that, was like, well, Paulie was very feisty, and he was willing to say things that maybe people didn't want to hear. And I think for Paulie's more thoughtful contemporaries and colleagues in a variety of different circumstances, I think there was a possibility to really admire this person without necessarily, with some complicated feelings of like, oh, are we going to have another argument at the board meeting? Is that, enough of this already? But,
yes.
Paulie is not one to sit quietly.
Right. With all of because I'm such a fan of asking around in Manhattan, I've yet to meet a person who spoke of her as a friend, which I found fascinating. So Julie, one of the gifts of having you here is, so I'm curious if in your work you found a spiritual or religious thread throughout her life, or multiple.
Yes, I certainly would say, and again, there were so many threads of story that we were trying to build into make one narrative, that we didn't get heavily into the religious spiritual side of things, beyond making it clear that of course this is someone who went to church every Sunday as a child, but we really followed that from Paulie when it became central in the 1970s. But yes, I think spirituality was a thread and a touchstone all along. And actually, despite some conflict with the actual official church apparatus, it was one area where Paulie didn't have a lot of push and pull exactly, like Paulie's feelings towards the church, just like Paulie's feelings to Aunt Pauline, and I don't think it's a coincidence, Aunt Pauline was the person after all bringing Paulie to church. Those feelings were actually not complicated. They were more like a lot of love. Paulie was certainly frustrated with the church's view, particularly towards women, a woman standing in the position that you're standing today, and that made Paulie and Rini and others in their circle angry enough that that it created some friction with church hierarchies. But as far as feelings towards the Episcopal Church and Christianity and the spiritual teachings, that's not something that Paulie turned away from in times of doubt. There certainly are references to the Bible throughout. There are things that Paulie writes in the autobiography, Song in a Weary Throat, that some of the most beautiful quotes are actually paraphrases from the New Testament. I'm Jewish, so I wasn't aware of that, but I found myself at various Q&As, I'll quote something. I'd love to end this by quoting one, and someone gave me a reference for where it actually comes from in the Bible, although Paulie it's not a literal, it's like a reference that, it's like sampling that I think anyone who grew up in the church would probably know. But there are spiritual ideas threaded throughout Paulie's work.
I think I might have told you this once, that when I came to St. Mark's, they gave me a Pauli Murray file. It's a very thin file, and it had some angry letters to leadership in the church. It was great, all kinds of things in it. But one of the things in it was so tender is it was the funeral leaflet for Winnie Barlow's funeral, and it had a little the obit clip in there, and it had some notes. So it was her copy of the program. So can you tell us about Winnie Barlow and Pauli Murray, and what do we know?
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty beautiful love story that started in the late 50s while Paulie was an associate at Paul Weiss, the big corporate law firm in New York, and Winnie was the office manager. Winnie was white and an immigrant from England, and felt like something of an outsider in all kinds of ways, and that's, by their own description, kind of what drew them together. That and religion, and the fact that they were both serious and practicing Episcopals. So we liked, and we included that scene in the movie where they're sitting, they go out to what's supposed to be a business lunch, and somebody makes a reference to the Book of Common Prayer, and then it's all like the sparks are flying. Like it's a very it's a very sweet reference to chemistry between people. This is not a relationship that was. It's almost hard to describe, actually. I think in a modern context, what a gay relationship that started in the 50s and went to the mid 70s when Winnie died was like, because in a way, like I think closeted would be unfair, because those that were around these two and were closest to them absolutely understood that they were a romantic couple, even if nobody ever said that. They never literally had the same residence. They always each had their own home, but that said, they spent a lot of time living under the same roof. Paulie helped care for Winnie's mother when she was dying, and then for Winnie herself when she had cancer, and was obviously devastated by the loss. I mean, we each kind of, the archive was so big that we broke up various parts of it, but one of the parts that I actually did do that was the one doing the digging into was all of the letters between Winnie and Paulie that are in the archive. I think I read all of them. And they were, romantic isn't quite the word, because there weren't like these sweeping, they were very much involved into going through the mundane details of life that made it very clear that they were 100% immersed in one another's lives. When we were choosing how to put that together in the film, which was difficult because there weren't, unlike all the audio tapes, there weren't audios of them talking about how much they loved each other, nor could we find a photo of the two of them together. But what made the letters, what was most notable is that they were all always calling themselves by nicknames, and the nicknames were constantly evolving. So we chose to focus quite a bit on that, including Winnie calling herself 007 numerous times. Like that was always, that was on a lot of the letters, which we took to be, and even somebody even Paulie even said Jane Bond at a certain point. To me, the idea seemed fairly clear that there's a little bit of like subterfuge here in our relationship, but that there's something kind of cool and sexy about that subterfuge. Like that's what I take it to mean. Yeah. We didn't explain it in the film, but we included it enough that we thought that viewers could draw their own conclusions. It's both beautiful but poignant, as Paulie said, at related to Winnie's funeral, like that, you've all lost a friend, I've lost my whole life here. And it was that loss that moved Paulie to do something I think Paulie had probably been thinking about for many decades, which was moving more concretely towards the church.
So I didn't know this until I heard this from you. So I had not understood that Reni's death was the reason, or one of the reasons, that she went to seminary. I just assumed it was about the timing of the ordination, the movement for the ordination of women in the Episcopal Church. So can you say more about what you think took her in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the thought that might have been opening up was part of it. But, remember, when Paulie started in seminary, that decision had not yet been made. It was not clear that it was going to be possible to be ordained as a woman. And Paulie just jumped ahead. Because, again, I think Paulie kind of was reading the writing on the wall and thinking that was going to happen. So, basically, I think the way that Paulie described it in a few fairly serious writings, again, Paulie for the most part wasn't saying this was my lover. Paulie was saying this was my best friend who died. But it created a crisis of faith for me. It did make me think, like, where are we really going? How have my efforts both on legislation, which Paulie did work on, I think we talk about that a little less in the film actually, but Paulie did some lobbying for legislation for equal rights, both racial and gender, and through the legal front for court cases. And Paulie was kind of like, where's this all really, where's this really going? Paulie's feelings towards Martin Luther King were actually very complicated in a whole variety of ways, but following King's death, I think Paulie was very much thinking that a sort of a bigger picture embrace of reconciliation between the races, and I think maybe Paulie would add between genders, is the way to go, and that ultimately that all stems from the big questions. Also, getting older made Paulie think more about mortality by many descriptions in the autobiography, and that sort of led naturally, in Paulie's view, towards back to the church.
I'll do one more, and then I'll let you all ask a question. I could do this forever. I'm very excited by this conversation. I'll put two things together that might not fit together, but I'd love to hear what you think. Pauli Murray celebrated Eucharist, I think it was her first, but if not her first, within that first year that she was ordained, at Chapel of the Cross, which is where one of her great-grandmothers, I think, was...
I believe her grandmother was where her grandmother came as a child.
Right, so her grandmother was baptized there. Person, and she... Right, someone's got the story right. Is it Horace? Someone's got the story correct. Yeah, right. So she celebrates Eucharist at that altar, and so for Episcopalians, like, those are two very embodied services and a pretty powerful act of reconciliation, frankly, right, at that altar, that she becomes the priest at that altar, and in her body, right, within which she struggles very publicly around her own gender, or not publicly, but publicly for us because we can read the letters, right, around her gender identity. So I just find that, I find it so moving. One, that body is ordained, and that body becomes a site of sacrament for us, and that she goes back to that place. So for someone who's not an Episcopalian, what did all, can you say something about all those things? Pauli Murray, her body, the altar.
You're coming to that from your religious background. To us, that part of the film so much stemmed from the footage that we were fortunate to have. It was like, it was really the only color footage that we had of Paulie. The shots that are also of Paulie visiting the childhood home and walking one of the many Paulie's collection of beloved dogs are all from that same day, from that same shoot. And what came through to us in that footage is exactly what Paulie's grandniece, Karen Ross, is saying at the time, is what a changed person this is. I mean, you've described people, and I also, we also connected with various people, including members of Paulie's own family, who talked about someone who could be pretty difficult, pretty bristly, I think is maybe a word that I would use. But yet, on that Sunday, like, the hugs with strangers, you know, the white North Carolinians in the 1970s who perhaps are relatives of, you know, the enslavers of Paulie's family. Complicated, of course, because Paulie's own relatives were actually on both sides of, you know, were both slave owners and the enslaved. But like the genuine warmth of those hugs and like the like just like the beaming, you know, how deeply Paulie seems to be feeling that experience, like read as very loving and sort of spiritually beautiful in, you know, in exactly the way that you can imagine the most intense words of Christian theology about, you know, turning the other cheek and loving your brother and embracing all for the good of, you know, for the glory of God. I mean, it's like it just felt like it's all really there. And to me, it felt like a very spiritual moment, whether you want to think of that as theological or just, you know, in a human-y kind of way, or, you know, probably preferably both. And I feel like you could just see it on Paulie's face.
Yeah. Yeah, she's glowing. Yeah.
She would tell everybody after she was ordained that was the first thing you would know about her. You would know
That she was a priest.
I only met her in the 1970s.
Can I, you have to come to the microphone so people on the video can, if you don't mind. Oh yeah, no one can hear you. Yes, this one is great. And there's a camera right there, so yeah. This is Pat Merchant, who was among the first women ordained in the Episcopal Church, and knew Pauli Murray, or had met Pauli Murray. Yeah.
Yeah, I met her and I kind of watched her, you know, I didn't really. But she came on the scene just as we were all being ordained, which was in the 1977, right after, in January. I don't know the exact date, but she was ordained in the first 2 weeks of January, I know.
January 8th.
January, well, that's close, thank
Yeah,
you.
that's my ordination anniversary too. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but all I remember is that when I went to North Carolina, I was a group of women there. All I could remember was she looked like she, you know, we have a very repetitive story in our tradition of the Transfiguration where Jesus goes with his disciples and they all turn white and they're just transformed. And it reminded, when I look at your movie, that's what she seemed to be like to me. Like she just shone, and all the bitterness and anger and a lot of frustration just fell away from her. Mm-hmm. And you can physically see it in her body. At least, you know, maybe I was projecting, but I felt that, you know, and it made me feel, because I had worked for 7 years to make sure the Episcopal Church ordained women, it gave me a huge sense of grace that I could actually have done something that helped that woman in her journey. So that was a gift that you gave me, and I'm very appreciative of it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pat. Are there other questions or comments? Come to the microphone, please. I know we're not shy. Neil, yeah.
Thank you very much for what you've done. This is just fantastic for us, especially me, since I had never heard of her. And now I'm thinking it's like a household word to Patty and me, my Patty. Do people of destiny, or speak to us about people who have a sense of destiny, which I think I got that she had, portrayed in all the pictures that I remember seeing of her. She always has this smile on her face, but I feel also a sense of her being unfulfilled and maybe not a happy person. Is that true of many people of destiny, like King and others who have done so much and yet felt unfulfilled and yet knew they were on the right path, trying to portray happiness and fulfillment, and on the other hand, maybe not really feeling that?
It's a really interesting question. I don't think I can generally answer it. I would say, from having spoken with a lot of friends of Paulie's and family members, as well as reading so much material, certainly there was a lot of frustration and sadness in Paulie's life. At the same time, there was a fair amount of joy. And as far as all of the things for society that Paulie was working towards, Paulie's main position on all of that was just like a relentless, unstoppable optimism. Like and you know, I think you could move that towards a lot of historical figures who are pushing for things that feel out of reach in their lifetime. I mean, kind of the two that come to mind, as well as Dr. King, would also be Gandhi. Like in situations where one has nothing, where one might appear to have very little to be optimistic about. These are people that found a way to somewhere within themselves come to a place of optimism and of a sort of certainty that one day, you know, we're going to get to where we're going, the promised land or otherwise. I guess because if you stepped back and thought this isn't going to work, how would you wake up every morning and continue doing the difficult and in these cases actually very, very dangerous work that's required?
While we wait for the next person to come up, this is probably just timely. Pauli Murray wrote a letter, I can't remember to who, but you will remember, laying out her qualifications to serve on the Supreme Court.
Yes, it was to Richard Nixon, actually.
That's what I thought. It was to Nixon. She was as qualified as Thurgood Marshall, basically. I mean, yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, you know, I would recommend people, I've been meaning to look it up because obviously it feels very pertinent this week. You know, the tone of the letter was kind of like, you know, why not me? Like, let me introduce myself and explain why I would be a good Supreme Court justice. I do not think that Paulie was, despite what I'm just saying about relentless, was expecting or even trying to be nominated. I think Paulie was trying to make a point. The tone of the letter is pretty taking a poke at Nixon. I mean, there were you know many reasons beside race, gender, and not having been you know a practicing attorney, not being a practicing attorney for many years, let alone a judge. But never mind that. I mean, just politically, like this, you know, Paulie was not going to be a Nixon appointee, but was trying to make a larger point. Like everything that Paulie wrote in these confrontation by typewriter moments, it is not only beautifully crafted, but also really fun to read. So. I forget whether that letter got published anywhere. It probably did, but I think it reads like a letter that's really more meant for publication and to lead people to consider, like, why aren't we thinking of a candidate like Pauli Murray as the right person for a position like Supreme Court Justice?
Yes. Yeah, I've seen it shared because of the recent nomination, and it's fantastic. All of her correspondence is fantastic. It's just, yeah. Are there other questions or comments? Yeah, you want to come up? Or do you want me to say it if you want to repeat it?
In the early, when Reagan was president and he was shot, have you heard this story? I was preaching an ordination sermon in the early 80s before she died. When did she die?
That I don't know.
Well, anyway, Reagan was president.
85, yeah.
And he was shot, and she wrote him a letter saying, and this is when I just fell out and loved her from my soul. She told him that he was going to go to hell because, and I thought, Paulie! You know, I'm sure the FBI was all, but this letter was so extraordinary. I mean, I used it in my sermon, and you could hear the congregation pin drop, you know, that somebody would write a letter to the president saying, you know, you're going to hell, and that's why that person tried to shoot you. And, you know, and I thought, I have been in a lot of trouble myself over the West, but I had never said, well, maybe I shouldn't say never, but I knew that was sort of a line where you just don't mess with the CIA. Anyway, I just wondered if you'd ever heard that story.
No, I was not aware of that letter, actually. And I'm not sure that it's in I'm not sure that it's in the archive, interestingly, because Paulie often would make carbon copies of letters that being sent out, not only letters received, so you can really see everything that Paulie was writing. Just like when a journalist came to interview Paulie, a tape recorder would come out. Paulie would bring out a tape recorder also. Everything was double recorded, which is how it came to be that other people's interviews of Paulie end up in the archive.
Nancy?
Hey, good morning. Thank you so much for your film. We really enjoyed it. 2 questions. I'd love to hear more about her relationship with her remarkable aunt, who just sounded like such an amazing force in her life. And the other part, the poignant part that just hurt my heart, was her struggle over her gender. And do you think she talked with her? I know she went to so many medical doctors, but did she talk to her aunt about that? And
That's a great question.
I'd love to hear more about Aunt Pauline. Thank you.
Yes. So Aunt Pauline was, I would argue, kind of the main force in Paulie's life, really, even after her death, even after Aunt Pauline's death, because of, that's what, someone whose childhood was so difficult, losing both parents before age 5, mom passing away, being taken away from dad, who was struggling with his mental health and ultimately was institutionalized, and then ultimately was murdered in a mental institution by a guard. An incredibly harrowing and horrifying story. But having this mother figure, and ultimately adoptive mother, because Aunt Pauline did legally adopt Paulie, who was so full of love, guidance, education, and acceptance, at a time when, and was just seemed to like innately understand Paulie's gender nonconformity into childhood, and called Paulie my little boy girl, or my little girl boy. Like that's, that was just the code language they used. And yes, we ended up focusing, because we were in a difficult position on the gender identity questions for the film, because nothing was said. There was no one who could speak about it who had been alive, and there was nothing in the audio tapes about it. What there were letters, and we found the most powerful letters to be between direct letters from Paulie to doctors. But yes, there also were letters back and forth between Paulie and Aunt Pauline about the whole situation, where Paulie is describing to Aunt Pauline, like, I've seen doctors, they say they can't help me, like, when they did their surgery. Again, it was another area where Paulie was doing so much research. Remember, there's not Google then. So how Paulie was becoming aware, which was correct, that testosterone was beginning to be used for medical purposes. And Paulie's thinking like, hey, like maybe testosterone would help me out. An idea when Paulie's first writing this, and I think like the late 30s, that would have seemed nuts to most people, which of course now, if you were a trans man, that's exactly what a doctor would prescribe. Like that would have been part of the path. Paulie also was wondering if perhaps she were intersex, had literal chromosomal and anatomical features of both male and female, something that really was unheard of at the day, but is a correct medical thing, and would have been something that I think, a doctor ruled out one particular strand of intersex. I think it's not impossible that Paulie could have been correct about. Like who knows? But yes, Paulie and Aunt Pauline were corresponding about that issue, with Aunt Pauline trying to always be a calming force, saying like, whoever you are is fine as long as you find some acceptance. I mean, which isn't just, I don't want to go too far, but Aunt Pauline was not like, oh, why don't you talk about, your non-conforming gender feeling, like that's your next speech. Like it was understood that this was a secret. But the two of them were absolutely talking about it.
I just have two quick questions. You may not be able to answer them directly from your work, but first, thank you for your extraordinary documentary, because for queer people of color, there's so much of history that we don't have. I didn't grow up hearing about Pauli Murray. I actually didn't know about her until last Sunday, right? And my first question is, do you think there was some level of intentionality that surrounding her sexuality that pushes her and Bayard Rustin and those to the fringes of history, right? That it's some shame around that within our own African American community that we don't celebrate them as much. And my second question is, do you know through her papers, did she have any collection of friends that were also in similar situations like Lorraine Hansberry or Langston Hughes, who also had, were either gay or binary? So those are my two questions.
Those are really interesting questions. And you're just giving me a thought, because Paulie was friends or did correspond with Langston Hughes, and yet I don't believe that those correspondences are in the archive, or if they are, I don't remember seeing them, and they're basically so it is, Paulie, as we were talking about before, sort of curated what was in that archive. So it's possible that those conversations did happen, and we just haven't seen them because they're not part of the public record. But as to your first point, I agree. I absolutely think that one poignant reason that Paulie isn't as well known as would certainly appear to be warranted is the fact that there were circumstances in which Paulie was keeping a lower profile because had even the secret of a romantic relationship with Renee Barlow been public, that could have been a big problem for Paulie's career. And in fact, when Paulie didn't get into the University of North Carolina in 1938 and wanted to challenge the university, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund wouldn't take the case, saying in Paulie's words, that she wasn't, quote, Simon Pure. It's not clear what was meant by that. Was it because of her sort of unusual presentation? Was it because they understood her to be gay, or because, sometimes Paulie was presenting as a man, and there are pictures that show that, even if that's not or there were some associations because Paulie had been involved in the labor movement, where there was certainly, you could have found associates who were connected to the Communist Party. So a lot of things could have been meant, but it could well have been that the NAACP and other branches of the civil rights movement were concerned by, this is not the right plaintiff, because what if everybody understood, we're trying to appeal to the establishment, and it's not going to help if we have an LGBTQ, not that those would have been the words at the time, person who we're pushing forward.
Yep.
I'd like to follow up the last question with a question about acts and omission of commemoration. And I'm hopeful you have some thoughts on this, considering you've been immersed in this process of research, and you've been deciding what to stitch in and what, unfortunately, you would have to leave out of the documentary. So many different avenues were explored by Reverend Murray, and she was an advocate and a pioneer in so many different ways, and those different fields are starting to decide how to commemorate her on their own. The church, the legal field, Yale University, places like that. And for good reason, sometimes they focus in on one aspect of her life that resonates in particular with them. But at the same time, they underplay or maybe omit substantially other aspects of her life. And for example, I have some LGBTQ friends who are very upset with the way the Episcopal Church has gone about being relatively silent about her gender nonconformity, and how that gets celebrated as part of who she was and what she did. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how we try to tell her story, even if we're focusing on her role as a priest or in that kind of context.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a difficult question. I think the best route would be to take a page from Paulie's playbook and go for, broadness and inclusivity. And, Paulie had the phrase, when my brothers draw a circle to exclude me, I draw a bigger circle to include kind of all of us. And there are, it's beautiful that so many different groups want to claim Paulie, Sometimes, really unfortunately, in my view, that leads to like these weird fights between people who are saying like, oh, you know, in some cases, lesbians wanting to appreciate Paulie as a lesbian feminist versus others saying, no, this wasn't a lesbian, this was a trans man. And it just feels like, oh, shouldn't we all be like, shouldn't we all be like, shouldn't this intellectual argument be the equivalent of the embraces that Paulie is giving the church members back in the 70s? Like, isn't that the way to celebrate the legacy? And can't each group, whether it's the church or the women's movement or the civil rights movement or the LGBTQ movement, can't we all be embracing Paulie and using it as an opportunity to come together and think bigger?
You all helped me to thank Julie Cohen. Thank you so much for being with us today. Draw the circle wider. I think we can stick with that. Thank you all, everyone, and we'll do a lot more on Pauli Murray. We haven't even begun to touch the topic. Thank you, and thank you for the fine film. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet you.